If you've ever been unlucky enough to touch a hot stove, you may have noticed that you pull your hand away before you even realize you're in pain. Why does that happen? Well, the answer has to do with different types of responses controlled by the nervous system. In this video, we're going to compare two different types of responses, reflexes and reactions. Let's start with an overview of how the nervous system controls responses. It all begins with sensory receptors, organs in your body that perceive changes in the environment. That input is carried through the body to the central nervous system, which, as we know, consists of the brain and the spinal cord. The job of the central nervous system is to integrate, to take in that information from the senses and produce some sort of response via motor output. And that is part of the peripheral nervous system. And the effect is that some sort of response occurs. So both the sensory input and the motor output are the responsibility of the peripheral nervous system, the various neurons running throughout your body, whereas the integration of the information is due to your central nervous system. Now, let's see how this works in the case of reflexes. And we're going to use a typical reflex that you might have experienced at the doctor's office, the knee-jerk reflex. So it all begins with a stimulus, some sort of change in the environment, which in this case is the tap. That stimulus is perceived by sensory receptors. In this case, there are receptors for touch in the skin. The information from the receptors is relayed to a sensory neuron. So this blue line indicates the sensory neuron. Here's the cell body, and here you can see incoming signal, this would be the dendrite, and then outgoing, this would be the axon. That sensory neuron sends the information to another neuron, the interneuron. The interneuron is found in the spinal cord. So here you can see a synapse between the sensory and interneuron. The interneuron then relays that information to another neuron, the motor neuron. Here you can see a synapse between the interneuron and the motor neuron. The motor neuron is going to carry information to something that will cause the change. Those are known as effector cells. In this case, the muscle will cause the response. So here we see that the reflex involves both the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. However, note that the central nervous system only includes the spinal cord in this case. A reflex skips the brain, and that's one reason why reflexes are so quick. So to sum all this up, reflexes are fast, simple, automatic, involuntary responses to stimuli. You don't think about them because they don't involve the brain. They only involve peripheral nerves and often the spinal cord. And here are the basic steps that we just observed in the knee-jerk reflex. Let's take a look at these steps very quickly in the case of the hot stove. So the hot stove is our stimulus. Sensory receptors in the skin detect the heat. Here is our sensory neuron carrying the information to an interneuron of the spinal cord, which then sends the information to a motor neuron, which then causes a response in a muscle cell, and your hand moves away. Very quick, 3 simple steps. Note something interesting here. In the past, we only saw neurons synapsing with other neurons, but now we see that neurons can synapse with muscle cells and other types of cells to cause responses. Now let's compare that to reactions. You've probably heard people describe athletes as having good reflexes, but is that accurate? No, it's not. And here's why. A reaction, let's say to catch an oncoming ball, involves more than just the spinal cord. So we have to sense the information using our eyes, but then that information gets sent to the brain for processing, and often multiple parts of the brain have to process the information before the info heads out to a motor neuron and a response occurs. So unlike reflexes, reactions are slower. They're more complex, and the reason is that they involve the brain as well as the spinal cord and peripheral nerves. And that concludes our explanation of reactions versus reflexes.